Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Paul Carantona, an Assistant Director with UNH Alumni Relations, and I have the privilege of introducing our speakers. This webinar is part of our Alumni Relations series. We have webinars scheduled throughout May and more on the way for June. Please check your email, follow our social media, and see our website for upcoming programs. All webinars are recorded and can be viewed on our website. Today we are joined by professors of sociology, Lawrence Hamilton and Thomas Safford. Larry teaches courses about society in the Arctic, survey research, and statistical analysis. His research focuses on human-environment interactions in locations ranging from Arctic Alaska to northern New England or the Intermountain West. Tom's research focuses on understanding the social basis of environmental attitudes and beliefs, perceptions of science and scientists, and analyzing interorganizational relationships among public and private sector actors engaged in environmental management. He is exploring how public perceptions of science and scientific practice affect policy debates, such as those related to climate change, ocean and fisheries management, and global health pandemics. We will be taking questions throughout the webinar. If you have questions, please submit them to the Zoom Q&A feature. Please do not use the chat function for questions, as they sometimes get lost in the feed. And with that, I would like to pass the reins over to Larry and Tom. Thank you both.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I'm Larry Hamilton, as you heard, and Tom and I are both sociologists at UNH. And if we could look at the first slide, we've studied a lot of things over the years, but we study what the public knows and understands about science, about the environment. We've been doing this for quite a long time. Here's an example from a nationwide survey that Tom and I did in 2016. We asked people, do you trust science agencies such as NASA for information about climate change? And 72% said that yes, they did. Only 18% were unsure, and only 10% said they did not change. So overall there's a fairly high trust in science agencies. This is just one example. The next slide will show you 5 examples. And something that we see in all these, we weren't really looking for it, but you can't avoid it, is that there's a gorilla in the room. The graphs you see here, the 5 images, are 5 different domains of science. And for each one, we've broken down the percentage that trust scientists in that domain by whether the respondents identify as liberal, moderately conservative, or conservative. And for every one, you see this similar gradient. That liberals and moderates tend to trust science. And the topics here, reading from upper left, are vaccines, climate change, nuclear power safety, evolution, and genetically modified organisms. So on all 5 of those topics, and we tried to choose things that had a very different discourse, very different debate in the public sphere. Across all 5 of those, what you see is that liberals and moderates tend to trust scientists, and the most conservative frequently don't. So there's a basic socio-political gradient that we are seeing in all these different questions. Next slide. And then, of course, what's happening nowadays is the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was a fairly direct shift for both Tom and me to start asking questions about this on our surveys and using some of the same formats. What you see here is responses to a question we asked in a statewide New Hampshire survey this March. We asked, this was before Governor Sununu issued his stay-at-home order, and we asked people whether they were already making changes to their daily routine because of the virus. And about 77% said they were making major changes, such as staying home more often. And recall, this is before the official stay-at-home order. Another 18% said they were making minor changes, such as washing their hands more often. And only 6% at that time said they were making no changes. So there's a very strong reaction to the virus in New Hampshire, even before there was any government order. Next slide. And we repeated the same questions, the same survey, about a month later. That first survey was mid-March. The second survey, again statewide, we repeated in mid-April, and asking some of the same questions. What you see here, the blue bars are the percentage results from the March survey, and the red bars are the same question in April. So the first question was the one you just saw. Did you make any changes in your daily routine or as a result of the virus? And in mid-March, before the stay-at-home order, 77% said yes. In mid-April, after the order, it was 79%. That's not a significant difference. Now, of course, major changes meant something different in April than it did in March. In March, people were canceling travel plans and maybe going out to dinner less often. In April, everyone was staying home from work. Still, there's little change there. Now, the second pair of bars you see here, we asked them, how confident are you in the federal government's ability to respond effectively to the virus situation? And in mid-March, only 46% said that they were very or even somewhat confident in the federal government's ability. In mid-April, it was virtually the same. 47% were very or somewhat confident in the federal government's ability. So no change there either. And the third pair of bars here, the third question that we'll look at today, we asked a question, do you trust science agencies such as the Centers for Disease Control for information about the virus? So that's basically the same format of the question I showed you a minute ago about trusting science agencies such as NASA on climate change. Here we're asking, do you trust science agencies such as CDC on the coronavirus? And we had 77% in March and 72% in April. The change is not significant. There might be a little bit of erosion there as there was more public awareness that the CDC actually had done quite poorly in the early days of the pandemic in terms of rolling out a workable testing regime. But overall, what you're seeing here is that the whole world had changed between these two surveys, and yet the survey responses changed barely at all. So why would that be? Why, when the world changes, why do people answer the same on the surveys? Next slide.
Larry, if it's a good time, we actually have a question.
Oh, okay, all right. I'll pause it. We'll pause on that slide and take the question, Paul.
So it's a two-part question, and the question goes: when you do your surveys, how do you select and contact participants? The second part is, what impact do you think that does or doesn't have on the data collected?
Excellent questions. We try to make the surveys as representative as possible. And in the past, that meant basically calling random cell and landline phone numbers, getting a large sample. You normally, for a survey, want 500 or more respondents. The UNH Survey Center, which does all our polling, had to close down their call center as a safety precaution in the time of the virus. And so we don't have a group of people making telephone calls for us anymore. And instead, they're turning to an online survey format. They have a panel of people that had said they'd be willing to participate in future surveys. And they draw randomly from that panel. And then as we get, after we see the responses, there is a mathematical adjustment called probability weighting, so that you adjust the responses so that they more closely resemble the New Hampshire population. So the March survey was about 650 people. The April survey was more than that, something over 1,100. And in both cases, we've made some adjustments. The samples were as random as we can make them to begin with, but we've also made adjustments after getting the data so that they resemble the New Hampshire population with regard to things like age, sex, region of New Hampshire, and even political party registration. So we're trying not to get too many Democrats or too many Republicans. But this is something we think about a lot, so that's a very good question. Okay, next slide, I guess. All right, so my question on the last one, everything had changed and yet nothing had changed. Why were those responses so stable? And the answer, I think, is that already, even though it's a brand new topic, the COVID-19 situation has become, opinions on that have become tied to people's socio-political identity. In the old days, we might have just said politics, but it's become more clear that this is really part of people's social identity as well. And that as part of their social identity, a lot of people filter information so that they hear things that are, they hear and read things that reinforce what they already believe. You know, one indication of this, the graph here just shows our leaving home less often question, or our question about have you made major changes, broken down by how frequently people watch Fox News. And there's a significant gradient there that people who never watch Fox News or only occasionally watch it are much more likely to have made major changes in response to the virus compared with people who watch Fox News every day. Now, this is only one example. I could put up others, but it is part of the clue that this the coronavirus situation has become linked to these much more long-standing public attitudes about science. Next slide will give you a second example. Again, with the same question, here we see that that same question broken down by how strongly people believe, how strongly people approve of President Trump's specifically handling of the coronavirus situation. And again, you see a substantial difference that people who approve of President Trump are less likely to have made major changes in response to the virus. People who don't approve of him are more likely. An interesting thing about this, I don't have a slide that'll show that, but the approve disapprove question actually has like 7 shades of gray, from strongly approve to strongly disapprove and everything in between. And the middle is almost empty. Almost everyone strongly approves or strongly disapproves. There are very few people neutral or even saying that they moderately approve or disapprove. So it's a very divided situation, and that division has mapped onto how people are behaving during a pandemic. Next slide.
Hey, Larry, we actually have another question.
Sure.
Do the actions and statements of international organizations, specifically those of the World Health Organization's Director General, who initially praised China's transparency in response to the virus, create an atmosphere where it is challenging for many Americans to differentiate between politically motivated disinformation and sound medical or scientific advice? It's a long one, I can ask again.
Well, let me try. So distinguishing between disinformation and scientific advice, absolutely, that's a problem. That's a huge problem regarding COVID-19. And unfortunately, it's exactly the same problem we've been seeing on many other topics, ranging from climate change to vaccine over a period of more than a decade. So yeah, there's a huge amount of disinformation out there on the website, on the interweb. Internet, I'm getting confused here, but also promulgated by ideological media, by people who have something to persuade you of. There are a lot of good sources that work directly from science, but there are a lot of other sources that will filter that science in a way to make a politically linked point. Regarding what WHO has announced or what President Trump has announced, I suspect most Americans are not keenly aware of the position or the activities of WHO. And I say that just from a lot of survey data showing that the public knowledge of international events in the US is not high. That people sometimes kind of know things are happening, but if you drill down for knowledge, there's not as much knowledge. I think knowledge is higher about what's happened domestically. For instance, what Trump said, who was certainly praising China's transparencies in the early days of the pandemic. But even there, people are often kind of vague about what was actually said, and they may remember instead what they've been told was said, and that may be a different thing. Okay, so I've shown a couple of slides about how there were political gradients on how people are responding to the virus. So what? Well, this graph is, it bears more closer reading, and I won't go into much detail about it, but this is based on analysis of both our surveys. What you see, the left to right axis there is how confident people were in the federal government's response. So at left, they said they were not at all confident in the federal government's ability, and at right, they said they were very confident in it. And the low to high axis there is the probability that they were making major changes, such as staying home less often. And then the three different lines, the top line, the blue line, if you can see that, is people who said they trusted science agencies. And the bottom line, the red line, is people who do not trust science agencies. So here's what we're looking at. Top left, the highest point on the upper left on the graph is people who do trust science and are not confident in the Trump administration. And those people have more than a 90% probability of making major changes in response to the virus. Then we slide down to the far lower right, the lowest point on the graph. Those are people who do not trust scientists, but they're highly confident in Trump, and they have less than a 50% chance of saying they made major changes. So what you see here is that these attitudes towards science and also political identification are shaping people's behavioral response to the virus. Now, where does that place us going forward? I think we have a lot of indications that over the next weeks, an increasing number of government restrictions on daily activities will be eased, will be lifted, maybe not to pre-virus levels, but certainly be relaxed. I think what's going to happen is that some people are going to stay home anyway, or their behavior will not change that much if they can, because they don't much trust the government and they are listening to scientists. And the scientists overwhelmingly are saying it's too soon to be easing those restrictions. Conversely, you have other groups of people who are very much listening to the government and who are not much listening to scientists. And I think those people will change their behavior very quickly and go back to normal, if not totally pre-virus, at least much closer to pre-virus behavior. So you're going to see people moving in different directions, regardless of what the government does and regardless of what the scientists say. Some people will be listening to science, some to government, and they're going in opposite directions. Okay, and my last slide is sort of the so what slide. What happens then? And this is a picture of the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases in New Hampshire. If you start at lower left, there's a series of blue bars there that are the time we were doing our March survey. And in the middle of the graph, there's a series of red bars that are the time we were doing our April survey. So you can see how much it changed. Now, there's also a red vertical line about a third of the way across, and that is the timing of Governor Sununu's stay-at-home order on March 26th. So what you see is that from no cases, New Hampshire sort of ramped up exponentially, and the exponential increase kept going. That's a steepening sort of ski jump look there. Steepening curve for about 10 days after the stay-at-home order, because that's the latency period for the virus. And then there's a decline. The stay-at-home order seems to be having some effect. The number of new infections declines for a while, but then it starts by second week of April, thereabouts, starts creeping back up again. The blue line is the 7-day average, and that's probably worth watching that more than the day-to-day changes. And the 7-day average starts creeping up again. So the stay-at-home order flattened the curve. It stopped the exponential growth, but it did not stop the expansion of the virus infection in New Hampshire. And it's gradually creeping upwards again. If stay-at-home were lifted tomorrow, you could expect, with about a 10-day lag, the rate of new infections to start taking off again. I'll just say a couple more things about this graph. One is that the rate of diagnosed infections is partly a function of the actual number of infections and partly a function of the amount of testing. So we're keeping an eye on that too. Both things are at play here, but the number of it's more complicated than that. It's not just that you test more so you find more. One of the criteria for testing is whether or not you're already exhibiting symptoms. So the number of tests itself is also partly tied to the number of people infected. So where this is going, we're tracking it every day. You can too. There are a number of really good sites such as New Hampshire Public Radio that are doing this, that have on their website daily updates. And I'm afraid we're running an experiment along the lines of the social divisions I pointed out in the last slide between people who are listening to scientists and people who are following the statements of the federal government as far as what one should do. So how did we get here? At this point, I think a longer term perspective is helpful, and I'll turn the conversation over to Tom.
If I could interject in between, I have a question for you before you hand the keys over. We have a question, and I'm sure you'll have some too, Tom, so we'll give you your day to shine. The question we have here is, does a person need to be conscious or aware of his or her ideology in order for it to affect that person's trust in science? To what extent does tribal identification, especially among extreme groups, override issues of ideology or science?
Well, I think it's putting it well, and that's part of why I've stopped using the word ideology. I think it's social identity is a better description. And no, people might not identify as belonging to a particular party or having a particular ideology. What is maybe more indicative is their information filtering. You know, where are they going for their sense of reality? And of course, that does link to politics and ideology, but the people may not be aware to what extent they're going to sources that will tell them that their prejudices were right, that what you already believed is even more true than you thought. And that is really the sort of reinforcing spiral that we're in here, that the more sure you are, the more you go only to those places that tell you you were right, and now you're even more sure.
We actually have another question in a similar vein. And it is obvious and sad that individuals' opinions are driven by their political lens. Why is this? We now have reasonable data sets around COVID-19, albeit not perfect, yet today policy on both sides, Democrat and Republican, seems more driven by entrenched view, not less.
Well, I would say I see a lot of analogies to climate change, which is a field I've been working on for quite a while. And there you have sort of Republicans holding to the Republican Party line and Democrats more to the Democratic Party line. But a difference is that the Democratic Party line is a lot closer to what the scientists are saying and what the data are saying. So it's not exactly that they're both adhering to their identity appropriate views. But on the one hand, you have the fact that New Hampshire winters are actually getting warmer on average. The seasons are ending sooner, the lakes are icing out sooner. And hundreds of thousands of scientists and organizations around the world are saying, yeah, this is happening. So one of those positions aligns with...
Hey, Larry, I think let's have you pause just for a second because your audio is getting messed up a little bit.
Well,
you're back.
Sure if it was lost, my point was that there are other criteria besides whether you're aligning with party, that aligning with science and with the experienced reality are two other criteria, and it's pretty clear what medical advice is regarding reopening. So I think that's another thing to consult rather than just party leaders, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, I think Larry has provided us with a kind of a great introduction to this topic. And I'm going to just kind of take a step back from the specific situation of the COVID-19 crisis and talk a little bit more about how I got here. And I know that one of the questions had kind of an international dimension to this topic. And that's actually how I came to this issue of scientific information related to pandemics and public health concerns. And while it certainly was probably off the radar of most Americans, certainly in comparison with what's going on today with COVID-19, back in 2016, there was another global pandemic, and this one was the Zika virus. It was specifically, it's a mosquito-borne virus, which is a little different, but it was affecting pregnant women and their unborn children. It started in Brazil, and I am a scholar who's focused a lot on Brazil and the role of, particularly of science and scientific information within environmental health and environmental topics there. So this quickly got onto my radar, and as the virus, which was there in Brazil, spread throughout Latin America and Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, and then eventually actually pretty severely hit Puerto Rico and South Florida, we, meaning Larry and I, started talking about this and connecting it with some of our own interest in this broader trend where we were seeing in New Hampshire and then across the United States of this increasing skepticism or concern, maybe mistrust in science and scientists. And so this became the basis for some survey research all the way back in 2016, both in New Hampshire and then a national survey that looked at this topic. And one of the things, there's obviously lots of things in there, and I have a link to a brief that he and I and my graduate student, Emily Whitmore, wrote about this. But probably the most important, or I think the most interesting piece of that, and it's something that we've continued to follow as a part of the COVID-19 crisis, is how people think about scientists themselves. So scientists as individuals, and what is scientific practice? Like, how do scientists do their job? How do they come up with the information and the results that they have? Because I think that what we hypothesized, as sociologists of science, that maybe it was how people perceive the behavior of scientists and maybe the values and ethics of scientists might be one of the explaining factors about why people maybe were increasingly distrusting of science. And so that became the basis of this research. And I think it has a lot of implications for what we're seeing today or right now with COVID-19. So you're going to see me refer to this question that we replicated. We started actually during the Zika virus period in a Granite State poll, which was an actual phone survey here in New Hampshire. And then we replicated it multiple times here in New Hampshire and then also in this national survey. And the short story of the question is we asked people, do scientists adjust their findings to get the answers that they want? And so we asked them a gradient of that from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And one of the things you can see, this is from the original survey at the time of the Zika virus when it was most problematic, and particularly in South Florida and the Southwest, was that you can see here 43% of respondents, and so in this sense 43% of New Hampshire residents, agreed that scientists adjust their findings to get the answers they want. And we found in a series of surveys in the low to mid 40s of respondents consistently said that they agreed with this question. So what this says is that there's a lot of people that have some belief that scientists at some level use their own personal interests or because they have an agenda, that might affect how they get their answers, how they do their job. And so this idea of science being this objective practice where you disassociate yourself from, there's one thing is your scientific practice and then your own personal beliefs, that we were finding that at least for many New Hampshireites and many Americans, they don't see that. They see scientists as interested. So this was interesting to me, that they're looking at the scientists as an individual and what they're doing as much as maybe the data and the results. And so we continue to do a lot of research on this topic, but the real question was, well, who is it that thinks that and why? And I think this is where you'll see the parallels to a lot of what Larry just told you. So here is a breakdown on those ideological lines. So in these surveys, there were questions about political ideology and political party. And you can see both in the national survey that we did around that time, as well as, which is the upper graph. And then the second graph, you see the same gradient where there's a significant relationship where people who are more conservative are much more likely to believe that scientists adjust their findings to get the answers that they want. So again, you're seeing, just like Larry showed in his questions related to the NASA data and all the other issues, science-based issues, this political gradient, we're also seeing that how Americans and people in New Hampshire look at scientists and the practice of science is in part a reflection of their ideological, and I would agree with Larry, this sort of social political identity is shaping how they look at a scientific person. And so you can imagine I'm going to talk about this in the current crisis, there are a lot of scientists, individuals standing up there talking about things. And if people are looking at that person as much as the data, there are certainly going to be parallels to what we are seeing here. The other thing that we did at the time of the Zika virus was also looking at this question and thinking, well, what are the implications for policy, or what are the implications for today behaviors? And at the time, we asked a question whether people thought there was a debate over additional funding from the federal government for scientific research and vaccine development related to Zika, as well as emergency public health responses, particularly in Florida and Texas. And so we asked people whether they, they thought that was important. And what you're seeing in this graph is like the relationship between people's views about scientists and their support for emergency funding to combat the Zika virus, or whether it was a high priority. And again, you see here, this is sort of like Larry's behavior question earlier that I'm going to revisit, is that those people that agree or strongly agree that scientists adjust their findings to get the answers they want are much less likely to support funding efforts by the federal government, funding science to combat the Zika virus. So this was an indicator to us at the time that these beliefs about scientists have implications for policy and have implications for, public health officials, in this case, maybe more isolated to South Florida and the Southwest, that people were not going to be supporting these activities in part because of what they thought about scientists. And this was, I think, at the time, obviously, we published about this material. And then, obviously, it was lucky, a very good thing that the Zika virus was tamped back and it's less of a problem. And actually, a vaccine has been created for the Zika virus. But unfortunately, we've seen with the COVID-19 crisis that these issues have returned. And so right at the beginning of this crisis, obviously, Larry and I have been thinking about these topics for quite some time. And we immediately thought, well, we need to revisit our data from the Zika era. And we looked at that very question that Larry showed it in the early parts of his slide about, do you trust science agencies like the CDC for sources of information? And while the overall trust is almost identical, we found, and we published a brief in early March about this, again, this relationship between both political ideology, and I would go with the extension that Larry had about socio-political identity, but also we had data from the time, 2016 is the time of the past election between Secretary Clinton and President Trump. And you can see that we also found there was this strong identification with President Trump being, again, people less likely to trust the CDC as a source of information. So again, another dimension of that ideological issue. And this is, again, was a big driving factor for getting back into this topic as a part of the COVID-19 crisis. And I would say that I'm really, I would want to call out or mention the support of the College of Liberal Arts and UNH for having the foresight to support us doing a survey on very short notice at the time that Larry was noting in early March. And we were able to ask similar questions again, and then the questions that you saw. So this is the scientists adjusting their findings to get the answers they want question from our March survey. And frankly, one of the positive things that I take away from these data, and you probably can see this, is if you look at the agree and strongly agree bars, which are the two lower bars on the graphic, they're much smaller. And in fact, there's a 22% decrease in the numbers of people that agree that scientists adjust their findings to get the answers they want in this survey compared with the Granite State poll back in late 2016. So this says to me at some level, maybe, this is a hypothesis that we would want to explore further, that the people are recognizing how important scientists are. Scientists were out there a lot at this time talking about this issue. This is, again, before there were maybe as many government officials really following the science, but the scientists were out on news programs, and certainly Dr. Fauci was out there talking about this a lot. And so this shows that, maybe this crisis is in part helping reinstill confidence in science that we had seen over a period of time, both Larry and myself and many social scientists seeing this erosion of confidence, erosion of trust in scientists. And so this is at some level a optimistic finding, and that I'm hopeful that science plays a really critical role. And I think most of us understand that in this time more than any. And this may be an indicator that we are seeing some positive trends that come out of this. However, in the survey in March, we did have party affiliation as another question. And what we see is that while the overall percentage that agree that scientists adjust their findings has declined by that large number, 22%, we still see there is a strong relationship between political identity, in this case, political party identification, and this is their self-identification with Democrat, Independent, Republican, and Tea Party, that there is a significant relationship with those who are Republican or Tea Party identifiers being significantly more likely to see scientists adjusting their findings to get the answers they want. So while the overall number is going down, it's still a very ideological or socio-ideological issue. And this raises concerns in the sense that we know that the virus doesn't know if someone is an independent, a Democrat, or Republican, whatever it might be. Everybody is vulnerable to the same extent, independent of those views or their any other part of their identity. And so we need to think about how are we reaching the entire population with objective information about the risks and the appropriate behaviors in response to the virus. So what I have here is the same question that Larry had earlier, which is the one where we asked in the pre-stay-at-home order whether people were adopting voluntarily those social distancing measures, taking extra precautions, limiting their interaction with other people. And what you can see here is there is, again, a strong relationship between people's beliefs about scientists and the likelihood that they were going to adopt those behaviors. You can see there's a 24% difference with those strongly agreeing that scientists adjust their findings are significantly less likely to have adopted those voluntary behavioral changes that we were asking about at the time of the survey in early March. So again, independent of those views that Larry showed about identity and other social factors that might be affecting the likelihood that people are going to make these behavioral changes, we can see here that one of the other things that's affecting is how people view scientists. And that makes sense if they're seeing a scientist on television, whether it's on Fox News or CNN or hearing it on NPR. If you believe that a scientist is just somebody who is creating results for some objective of his or hers, then that's going to be a lot different than if you're looking at, this is the data, these are medical and scientific professionals that are telling me what the best practices are. And so this is, I think, a really important finding as we move forward with, what is the next step? How are we going to, as a society and as a state, be able to address these concerns? So I'm going to end it here with just a couple of wrap-up slides, because often people have asked us in the context of our papers and the like, what we're doing in the future. I think it's important to continue to follow this. You saw how some of the trends stayed very similar in Larry's survey results they showed early on over our 2 March and April surveys. And we'd like to continue to survey them because as you can see here in this slide, there are going to be new pet therapeutics, there are going to be vaccines, and these are all going to be things that we are interpreting through the lens of science and medical professionals. And so how people look at the medical discourse or the scientific discourse about different drugs that we might be using to treat the virus, or a vaccine that hopefully will come out that will help protect us all from the virus. This is going to be important to understand, how do people see those things? Are they getting vaccinated? Are they using therapeutics? And it might be somewhat related to how they're thinking about science and scientists. And I think that I'm optimistic that this might be a time of reinvigorating the importance of objective science, the importance of stepping away from our individual, ideological or social values, and understanding that there are, facts about these issues, and we need to use the best facts that we have available to inform our individual decisions, as well as my sort of final bullet point there, are on the ground policy and health management decisions. People that are public health people here in the state or on the street in Manchester or Portsmouth, or certainly nationally, are going to need to have good scientific information about these topics. And this is where I think research like our own, understanding how people perceive things is really important, because we need to, maybe we have to think about different forms of communication if we're going to reach everybody, because the virus certainly can reach anybody. We also need people to be making the right behaviors or understanding things in a collective and societal manner. So I'm gonna leave it there. Larry and I have a number of publications, and these are available through the Karshi School of Public Policy, which has done a lot of interesting work or important work on these kinds of topics. And we'll put on this slide, and I think we got plenty of time for some additional questions. So I'm going to stop and open up to questions either for my part, or Larry and I can field them together.
Excellent. And we do have questions, so this is perfect. So do you have any thoughts on why there's so much anti-science sentiment in this country? And I guess I'd add my own little bit to it, and I'd ask, is the US unique in its maybe position and views on scientists and science compared to maybe other countries?
Well, I'll take the second half of that question, since I'm the international guy, and I might pass the baton back to Larry for the first question. Because actually this is part of my own research. I am interested in how other countries think about science. And while certainly it's pretty clear that science has become an ideological issue, a political issue here, and Larry has shown in a myriad types of topics, obviously the pandemic, we're seeing that. We see it with climate change. We see it with GMOs, food, animal rights, all kinds of things. And so I think that this is something that's very ideological here. And my experience is that it is much less so in other places, almost to the fact that it is not at all a political issue in other contexts. And so that's an important question. I think if you look at Europe now, or even other countries in Asia and South America, it certainly hasn't taken on this ideological dimension in terms of thinking about the coronavirus and these other topics. Or, for example, climate change is not nearly as politicized, or hardly politicized at all in, say, South America, Africa, most of Europe, and yet it is extremely political here. And so I think this is kind of, it's been adopted by, in large part, I think the media is a big part of that. But I'm going to let Larry talk about the US context, because he's certainly an expert on this topic.
Yeah, Tom's absolutely right that these science topics have become much more politicized in the US than they have in most other industrialized countries. And climate change, which has come up a number of times, is kind of the biggest case. That's where these huge divisions are. You could almost ask people what they think about climate change instead of asking their political party or ideology. They're almost the same thing in the US and very few other places in the world. And that's that's been manufactured to some degree. A few decades ago, environmental protection was a bipartisan issue. The major environmental legislation in this country, a lot of it was signed by Republican presidents. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species, and so forth. So at one time, they were not so politicized even here. But there's been a very strong campaign against environmental protection on the one hand, and because science was often speaking up and saying things like, well, mercury pollution is bad for you, it had to be an attack on science too. So that has been largely constructed in the US by the aid of political media over the last couple decades. And there are a number of studies, quite a few studies, that have looked at this in some detail. In many other countries, you don't see this happening to the same degree. Rather interestingly, you're starting to see more of it in a few of the other English-speaking countries that share some of the same media enterprises. Australia and the United Kingdom, especially England, come to mind. And I'm working with colleagues who study those places, and they agree they're seeing these changes as well.
Excellent, thank you. Another question here. States that traditionally trust science and not the current administration are the ones who are apt to follow the rules, yet are also the ones with the highest number of cases and deaths. The opposite is also true. Do either of you have an explanation for this?
Well, New York is by far the worst case in the U.S., but I'm not sure it's true as a generalization beyond that. Aside from the fact that the places with larger population densities are seeing more changes first. Washington and California responded very differently, maybe more quickly, especially in the case of Washington, which was where the initial infections were identified in this country, and they followed a somewhat different path. Other places like Florida that were initially seeing New York as a bad example are now have a lot of hotspots of infection themselves, as for example does Georgia, South Dakota, New Mexico. So this is something that spread initially maybe through international travel. In the case of Washington, possibly coming from China, but in the case of New York, apparently coming from Europe. And then many cases from New York spread elsewhere in the country, and other places such as Florida become secondary spreading centers with things like the spring break arrival. So I don't think you can make any clean description about state policies and their infections. What you can do is look in each case at how did they respond once it started getting established there, and did they do things that have been effective in shutting it down, or were they just lucky in that they were not an early epicenter where a lot of the initial infection took place before nobody saw it.
I might add one thing to that. If since we have our publications up here, we on the survey, there's, in addition to the question that Larry mentioned about how people evaluated or assessed President Trump's response, we also there was on that same survey a question about Governor Sununu's response. And obviously Governor Sununu is a Republican, and for the most part, people had a much more positive. They didn't associate him with the same kind of division, that bifurcation of the result that Larry said. So I think that to make it strictly a partisan issue it's also just how people are talking about science. And I think that here in New Hampshire, we've heard more about the scientific necessity of staying home than we've heard maybe in the national political dialogue. So I think that they're sort of to say it's only blue states, red states, maybe misses sort of that critical scientific communication, or how science is involved in the sort of dissemination of that is another important piece of this.
We actually have a few questions about biases potentially amongst researchers, and so there's a couple here. One is, research is funded by grants, which is largely provided by the government. Is it possible scientific research is indirectly biased by political views and directly biased by alignment to funding sources?
I'll address that first. I've been doing grant-funded research for a long time, and I have never experienced any direction from the granting agencies or the government regarding what my findings should be. It just doesn't work that way. If it did, I guess you might expect to see it sort of conclusions about different things blowing back and forth with the wind of different administrations. That you would see scientists finding, climate change is real during a Democratic administration and saying, no, it's not during a Republican. None of that is happening. So that just as you see this on the ground, it's not the source. And as scientists work, it's not really that they're looking at the agencies and thinking, what can I get funding for? It's partly they're having these ideas and thinking, okay, now how can I make this work happen? So Tom mentioned that for this coronavirus research we've done in the last few months, we got support from UNH. We had the idea, and actually Tom was the first one to think of it, that we wanted to do this research, and then it's a scramble to see, well, who could possibly support that? It's not top down of somebody deciding that they want a certain conclusion and then giving us money.
And I would add to that, I think that there is, the training of scientists is about the scientific method, about the sort of systematic, objective design, implementation, and analysis of results. And I think Larry and I, as social scientists, and I think probably anybody who's a scientist would tell you, there are times you get results that you didn't anticipate, or results that don't maybe necessarily match with what you might have hypothesized. And so I think that's an important part of the process. And And while it may seem a little opaque, the process of peer review, the process of vetting through other objective scientists, your research, your results is a critical part of that process too, independent of who funded it. To get something published, to get it out there, there's usually a pretty rigorous process that all science, whether it's social, natural, physical science, goes through. And I think it's a practice that's very different than maybe the average person might imagine it is, but it's challenging, and people will challenge your results and challenge, how you reach those results. And I think that's a good thing, and that's what leads to those kind of rigorous scientific outcomes.
Excellent. And then kind of in a similar vein, we have first a comment and then a question. First, this is a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Second, I'm wondering, has any research ever been done on the socio-political leanings of the scientists themselves? Could one of the reasons why those who distrust scientists be that they assume the scientists themselves are by default left-leaning? Many conclusions of good science can be also perceived as liberal views. So average people might assume scientists just skew their findings to what the scientists would like them to be. Thank you.
I think that's often said. It's not necessarily true. You have to turn that around a little bit and see that a lot of scientists like everybody else, have a lot of different political opinions. But then they start reshaping those if they discover that by saying, let's say, that the sea ice on the Arctic Ocean is getting thinner, that people attack them as being liberals, dishonest, perpetuating a hoax. That's going to push them. I mean, they're just looking at sea ice. They're out there on an icebreaker or looking at satellite data. And if from one direction of the political spectrum or the media world, they're all of a sudden be called hoaxers for what they see on the sea ice, that's going to push them away from one identity and towards others. And that's happening in a lot of realms. A lot of medical researchers are experiencing that right now for the first time. For some of them, they're being attacked as being politically motivated in saying that the virus is not done with us. And by being attacked for being political, they're realizing that they're being put in a box whether they want to or not. They're trying to talk about the virus, and yet they're being denounced on national news networks.
Excellent, thank you. Question, and that is, and I'm mindful of the time. We're coming up on 1 o'clock, so and we have a few more minutes for a few more questions. Have you found? I'm rephrasing, and I just should read it as is. Excuse me. What is a stronger corollary? Political affiliation or education level? Has that been part of your research?
Absolutely, that's a great question. And the short answer is politics. What happens, actually, we have quite a number of papers about this, is that politics actually changes the effect of education. So that people who are moderate to liberal, the more educated they are, the more likely they are to be concerned about environmental problems, or for that matter, a pandemic, as their education level rises. That is, they're likely to be more attuned with the scientific consensus in different fields, many different fields, as they get more educated. But among the most conservative, the more educated they are, the less they agree with scientists. So that it actually has opposite effects on many topics for liberals and moderates compared with the most conservative.
Excellent, thank you. This question actually came earlier on in the presentation, and it was commented that it's pretty clear that reopening should be based on science. When I read the CDC guideline about preventing COVID-19 spread, it is recommended to stay 6 feet apart to avoid close contact. Close contact is then defined as less than 6 feet apart for 30 minutes or more. I never hear this 30-minute detail, and I think that this might calm people down about wearing masks. This person's trying to base their thoughts in science and not their political leaning. Thank you.
Go ahead, Tom, you want to try that?
So I think that, again, I think one of the challenges here is, the science that's being provided whether it's from the CDC or other medical professionals that are out in the media talking about these things, is that it's all about, there's a process of using the best science. There isn't sort of an 100% answer. This is going to be the absolute solution versus this other thing is what you don't want to do. But my hope would be is as people look at recommendations, whether it's that one or other ones from the CDC or similar kinds of organizations at the state level, that these again are like following steps, and that hopefully as they understand that there is scientific research, however imperfect and evolving it is on these topics, that if we look at this process as being one driven by science, where we're going to follow those recommendations, and if people have some confidence in that, if we can instill more confidence in them, that hopefully would lead to people understanding what are the benefits for themselves, or most of the benefits of mask wearing is protecting others from you, with the chance that you might be asymptomatic and passing the virus. That's how I understand the science of this. But I think it's one of those things is if you come at a topic with a kind of a predisposition to be skeptical about science and skeptical about maybe what the intentions are of scientists, this is kind of linked back to the earlier question, then that may make you less confident or less likely to follow with some behavior that may be uncomfortable or maybe unclear to you. And so I think this is where, again, as we become more comfortable or confident in science, hopefully that will lead us to follow those recommendations, even when those recommendations may change, and not be someone saying, oh, well, the recommendation changed, so then that means these scientists are not trustworthy. It's more that just the science is evolving, and we need to have those evolving responses as the science changes, and helps us have more and more confidence in what we're doing.
Excellent, thank you. Let me see if we can squeeze in just a few more. In reviewing data, have you looked at how socioeconomic status or race/ethnicity impacts responses to these same questions?
Yes, that we always check that. We look at the effects of income, of education, of party, also of gender. In national surveys, we look at race. Age is another factor. And one of my first slides, I described politics as the gorilla in the room, because it always is. We're always, actually, I would like to be writing about other things. And yet, in all of these data, that dominates all the other things that you think might be important. Other things may have some role, but the socio-political identity dominates everything else. And that's, it gets kind of tired. It's not what I want to do, to keep making that discovery. Certainly, it would be more exciting to have some brand new thing, but when you do find new things, they're always secondary to this huge effect from socio-political identity.
Excellent. And this question here is, in your survey work, have you ever tried to define/describe the term scientist in such a way as to separate it from an idea of political manipulation? For example, trying experts or professionals and seeing if that makes a difference in responses.
We haven't tried that wording. We have done some experiments with small wording shifts in our questions that we thought might bias the answers one way or another. And by and large, I found that the small wording shifts, at least in the way we do surveys, have not made much difference. So I suspect if we said something like, scientists from NASA instead of experts who study something, that we'd probably get fairly similar results. But I honestly haven't tried that.
I would say there have been other people that are looking at these topics even more broadly, and I think that they're, the National Science Foundation actually does a survey itself of looking at public perceptions of science and scientists, and the short answer is, while it's not an exact, I can't say exactly what those other questions are off the top of my head, but they have asked it in different iterations, and unfortunately, the patterns that Larry and I have identified here tend to follow independent of the changing of the wording or even the type of topic. And I think even when we began this kind of research, we looked at we were doing a study on beach pollution. So, people had concerns about beach pollution, and it doesn't seem like it's a partisan issue. We asked a question about, are you concerned about your children's safety, based on pollution at the beach? And unfortunately, party was a strong predictor of what people would say. It's just sort of, it's that, that socio-political identity becomes so prevalent that even though beach pollution is certainly a lot different than climate change, in terms of the politicization of it, it's not normally politicized. Unfortunately, these kind of fallback identities persist independent of how you ask questions or what the topic is.
Yeah, that's the example Tom just gave about beach pollution was really a striking one from a paper he and I wrote a few years back, because we found that even regarding beach pollution, not only were there political different, and these are in coastal communities, how big of a problem, how serious a problem is this on your local beaches? And even there, we found not only is there a political effect, but there's the education effect that I described earlier, where the least polarized, the partisan polarization is least among people with high school education or less, and partisan polarization on beach pollution at your local beaches is greatest among people with college educations.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. We have a few more questions left, but I might just say one more, and then we'll go from there, unless we will keep the ball rolling. I don't want to hold people too past the time. We have a question here. How significant is 22% versus 15% difference between Democrats and Republicans' opinions, whether scientists can be trusted or not? And forgive me, I'm not exactly sure which slide that was from myself, but it must be pulling.
Slide, that might be about 16 or so. It was Tom's slide, but I'll take the significance part if you want me to. That one.
Oh, sorry. Now I'm the guy controlling the slideshow, and
right. It's the one before that.
Before that or after it?
I don't know. Maybe.
This one. Is it this one or my original one?
That's the one.
Well, I think the pattern is the same, and so I think you're going to be able to answer that, irrespective of whether I do it with this one or the original survey data that we had over a number of. Fire away, Larry.
Well, the question asks about the 15 versus 22%, which is comparing the Democrats with the non-Tea Party Republicans. And I'm not sure if that difference is significant per se. Overall, the overall pattern you see there is highly significant, but you can see that an awful lot of that is coming from the most conservative group, the people who identify with the Tea Party. So, I have another paper some years ago wrote with a grad student, Kay Sato, where we found that the most conservative individuals are the most different from everybody else, that there's a bigger gap between the most conservatives, such as people who would identify with the Tea Party, and non-Tea Party Republicans than there is between the non-Tea Party Republicans and independents. So the most conservative are the which of these things is not like the others on all of these surveys.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. With that, I'd just like to thank our audience, the folks who joined us and stuck with us for the whole time, and to thank both Larry and Tom for both your time. We've gotten many comments about wanting to have a follow-up, so we'll have to chat after this. Because we've got a lot of great feedback from the audience on the presentation. A lot of thanks. With that, I just want to say thank you all so much, and please feel free to join a future webinar, and we hope you have an excellent weekend.
Thank you, and thanks to the audience for all those good questions.
Yep, thanks.